And our next speaker is Stefan Kipfer, who is a teacher and writer at York University as Associate Professor in the School of Environmental Studies. He is also a student of urban politics and social movements, and his work is inspired by radical urbanism, European Marxism, and an anti-imperial, anti-racist feminist tradition. Stefan.
Thank you very much. Thanks for, Thanks a lot for having me here. It's a great pleasure. I'm not sure how much I can tell you that you don't already know, but I'll try my best to say a few things of use. What I'd like to do is just to make some basic remarks at the beginning about the uneven development of austerity politics and crisis, and also some of the diversity of political force for which austerity politics has been playing itself out, indeed since the 70s and 80s. And then in the second part, I'd like to give some context to what's going on in Toronto today, some longer-term context, to get a bit of a handle on Ford and his contradictions. On uneven development, as Sam suggested and reminded us, of course, economic crisis and neoliberalism is not a new phenomenon. It's been around for more than a generation. That's also true for the geography, of course, of austerity politics and neoliberalism. What has been happening in Toronto in the 90s and 2000s had already happened in different forms, of course, before, in different forms in Chile in the 1970s, particularly brutally through structural adjustment policies around the Global South. Remember the debt crisis in Mexico in the early 1980s, for example. So some of the things that we're seeing today may seem novel to us with some justification, but if we look around the world, of course, that gives us a different perspective on how new things are in Toronto today. What do I mean by uneven development of austerity politics? Well, we need to pay attention to the specificities of how austerity politics is taking place. Of course, austerity politics is a global, worldwide phenomenon, but it is important to take into account some of the specific ways with which this is actually happening. And that is also true for the social dimensions of austerity politics. There's also a social uneven development of how austerity politics targets different population groups and how it affects different population groups. And it seems to me that it's very important. That is very important to point out when thinking about a response to austerity politics, because although the majority of the population, indeed the 99%, is affected by austerity politics, there are rather important differences in terms of what austerity means for different people. Now, let me give you some examples about the uneven geographical development of austerity politics with specific reference to the local state, which is something that we're looking at here in Toronto, of course. The local state has, certainly in the European and American context, been sometimes of strategic importance in the development of neoconservatism and neoliberalism. You may remember 1980s Britain, when Margaret Thatcher abolished the Greater London Council in, I think, 1986 or 1987, I can't remember, either one of the two. And she did so recognizing that, first of all, the local state is an important part of the state apparatus, and sometimes it develops things that are not easily controllable by the centre. And under certain conditions, this can then pose a certain kind of set of problems and obstacles for neoliberal strategies, which is one of the reasons why Thatcher indeed just went about and abolished that level of the state in the London area in the 1980s. So often it is true that the local state is re-engineered from above through central state initiatives, but that's not always the case. Sometimes local state initiatives actually have been important experiments in the broader development of austerity politics. And here I'll give you a couple of examples One from New York City. As you may know, New York City went bankrupt in 1975, was put under trusteeship by the federal American government, and in the process, however, then developed a whole series of initiatives that actually, in some cases, took on the lead and the form of a model for the development of neoliberalism, certainly on this continent in the United States, but in some cases also in other parts of the world. For example, the initiatives developed under the Giuliani leadership in the 1990s and early 2000s often found their way into other kinds of municipal governments. You may remember last month's strategy to criminalize homeless people that was partly informed by the Giuliani strategy around the same issues. So this is a good example where in some cases the local state initiatives actually can have a broader effect and are not always imposed from above. An example I'd like to give to that is actually related to suburban politics. Because if you look at the local state, say in Toronto or other parts of the Euro-American world, we tend to focus on central cities. We tend to focus on those central municipalities that underwent some reform transformation since the 1970s, under the influence of various kinds of social movements, including the labor movement in some cases. But most suburban municipalities, particularly on this continent, actually never underwent that transformation. And I should remind you of where, for example, Ronald Reagan came from in the 1980s. He built his political base in Orange County, one of the most conservative suburban regional municipalities in the United States, in Southern California. And it's to some extent through building a local political base, through local experiments, that Reagan managed to put himself into a position of competing for the California governorship in the 1970s. And perhaps that's also a good example for how actually local politics can sometimes be very much at the forefront of some of the things we don't like. And certainly in the Toronto case, this is very, very important to realize, because if it is true that the kind of model for local politics that Ford wants us to adopt is a problem for us, well, that model has already been in existence in basic forms in most of the 9 of 5 municipalities, to some extent even in places like Scarborough and Etobicoke before amalgamation. So uneven development sometimes also means to pay attention to the kind of the ways in which local initiatives can have broader effect. The second brief point I want to make is about the diversity of political forms through which austerity politics can take place. We are now facing again, a hard-right populist form of austerity politics today, but you all remember, of course, that certainly since the late 80s, early 90s, it's been common for almost all political formations to propose versions of austerity politics. Right? So we've seen in this country, of course, the sort of a respectable, sober liberals being at the forefront of neoliberal initiatives in the 90s at the federal level, and then, of course, also in Ontario in the 2000s. We've seen third-way politics implementing austerity politics across Europe, and also under the Miller regime in the 2000s in Toronto. And then we even see some variations among hard-right politics. Right? We've seen the authoritarian populists, the Harrises and the Fords, making a virtue of conservative values, patriarchal values, racist values, nationalist values in their neoliberal projects. But we've also seen a sort of an authoritarianism and austerity politics by stealth at the Harper level over the last few years. Harper hasn't, for various reasons, the strategists around Harper have decided not to be too visible in their sort of public campaigns around austerity politics. A lot of the stuff that they've been doing is by stealth, almost invisible, right? So almost away from public scrutiny. And I think there too, that's sort of a different form through which austerity politics has been implemented implemented itself. So, what does that mean for Toronto? Where have we come from to get us to the situation today? Sam is right to point to the 1980s. You may remember the formation of OCAP in the late 1980s that responded to the signs of economic crisis. You remember the formation of homeless advocacy groups at that time, which responded to one important signal of the crisis at the time, which is the return of homelessness as a structural reality in the 1980s. In the early 1990s, in that particularly deep recession for the Toronto case, we sort of see the formation of broader coalitions to kind of fight signs of austerity politics, the Fight Back Metro campaign in the early 1990s, for example. At the metro level, at the level of the metropolitan government of Toronto. In the city of Toronto, we see the effects of the recession actually then scaling back some of the progressive initiatives from the late 1980s. Toronto decides in the mid-1990s to essentially deregulate planning in the downtown area. This is before amalgamation, and this is partly also then an influence onto the neoliberal turn in 1998. And then Harris comes into the picture in 1996. We all remember this, the fight back to Harris, the general strikes, the rather intense political period, 96, 97. You may remember, of course, that for Harris, the restructuring of the local state was a very important strategy in neoliberalism. Across the province, of course, but also specifically in the GTWA. He amalgamated the central municipalities and did not do the same thing in the 905, thereby setting up a competitive dynamic between the newer suburbs in the regions around the new city of Toronto and the city of Toronto itself. So that sort of inter-state competition dynamic was an important sort of mechanism through which Harris's government thought that austerity could be indeed entrenched through the local state. And then there was downloading, right? You all remember downloading, the downloading of public housing and public transit in particular to the municipal level. That has not been challenged as far as public housing is concerned ever since. It was challenged in some of the other areas, and I think certainly under the Liberals and with Miller, a few areas of downloaded responsibility were reversed, but not the totality of it. And of course, downloading in that sense was a very important mechanism to try to institute a regime of discipline, of fiscal discipline, particularly on the central city of Toronto, which had a public sector perhaps a bit more expansive and a bit more innovative than the suburban municipalities. Now, in 1998, we've got the election of Lastman. Lastman was the candidate of the Harris government. You may remember it was their man in the campaign result. And everybody expected, of course, that Lastman was really the Trojan horse for the Harris government in the city of Toronto, which turned out to be partly true, but Lastman wasn't as successful, I think, as Harris thought he would be. For various reasons, he was not, as committed to a hard right agenda as some people thought, and perhaps more importantly, it was some of the progressives and some of the movements in Toronto managed to kind of establish some limits to what Lastman would manage to do. And at the end of the day, of course, Lastman himself undermined his own regime with a corruption scandal that brought him down in the early 2000s when Miller was elected. What the Harrisites hoped would happen, which was that the suburban municipalities were going to overrun the progressive downtown, didn't quite happen. I think the way in which a lot of us expected it to, certainly I did, and the way in which probably some Harrisites thought would happen. But in a longer perspective, of course, one can say, well, if you look at Ford now, we have to look back at Harris and say, well, in the long term, some things seem to have worked quite well for the Harrisites at the time. To some extent, Ford really is the hope come true of the original strategy, as far as I can tell. I mean, not because Ford necessarily has to adopt to a provincial austerity agenda, but because, of course, he is pushing it himself in a rather aggressive, in a fashion that I think we haven't seen in Toronto in this generation. Why did Ford? What explains Ford? This is still a bit, to some extent, a bit of a mystery. I think somebody should have to write a book about it at some point. Certainly, as we all remember, it was a bit of a surprise for this crazy dude to all of a sudden find himself at the helm of the mayor's office after the last election. Certainly multiple things happened. We've had, of course, the global convergence of austerity politics happening at that time. The defeat of any mild attempts to re-regulate finance in a way that wouldn't strengthen finance in the process, right? I mean, that happened just in a year before the election. So the legitimacy crisis of neoliberalism that seemed to be happening in 2008, late 2008, seemed to have gone, even in places like Europe, for example, where it was a bit stronger. So there's a global context, which made it easier for most of the candidates actually in the election to push for an even more aggressive line on austerity. Clearly, the Board of Trade of Toronto and some of the ruling class exponents in the city all seemed intent on delegitimizing Miller. Now, Miller wasn't, an unqualified progressive. He was not opposed to neoliberalism, but perhaps he didn't quite. It wasn't perhaps quite reliable enough for some of the people. Connected to the Board of Trade, and so there was a clear sense that support for a mayoral candidate 2 years ago was contingent upon kind of saying goodbye to the village. And that wasn't just true for Ford, that was true for almost everybody except Joe Pantalone, who decided to defend the Miller regime as it was. It seemed also that beyond this sort of general support for an austerity agenda, Ford was particularly successful, more successful than his neoliberal counterparts, in exploiting some of the contradictions of the Miller regime. I mean, Miller had already centralized power at the mayor's office, which was a concern for a lot of people. For conservative people in the suburbs, for example, who were concerned about transit initiatives, for people concerned about development politics. So Ford played into this. He also played into the fact that Miller was not able to develop strong support for the labor unions, and so exploited that sort of tension between the Miller regime and some of the public sector unions particularly, which supported him at one level, but also, of course, were forced on strike and so on. So Ford exploited some specific contradictions that one can find in the Miller regime, and clearly his populism did not hurt him. Right? His rants against refugees, Tamil refugees, his rants against gay people, his aggressive rants against cyclists, and so on did not hurt him. Indeed, it's very difficult to find polling stations that did not vote for a plurality for Ford outside of some sections in the central city. Now, since the spring, of course, we've seen contradictions emerging in the Ford regime again. Partly, of course, this is because of opposition, like the opposition coming out of Stop the Cuts, like the opposition coming out of the Workers' Assembly, and so on. It's also partly a result of the blatant contradictions between Ford's own supposed agenda of fiscal discipline and the fact that he's doing pretty much exactly the opposite. You know what Sam was saying. The question of the deficit of fiscal discipline really is not the question. Ford is a good example for how public sector deficits are great, are the greatest things to some extent for austerity politicians, because it gives them a legitimacy indeed to attack labor, to cut back programs and privatize. But nonetheless, there has been a bit of a sense of cracks in developing in the Miller regime, partly as part of some of the opposition, and we've seen some musings by ruling class circles, including Civic Action, that were calling on Ford to become more respectable, more responsible, less fanciful, I suppose, in his initiatives. We've seen some votes at City Council becoming a bit more difficult for Ford to pull off. So we've seen occasionally some of his allies breaking ranks. Usually this is just an individual kind of situation at the moment. I don't think it's a systemic issue, but it has happened at the latest budget debates, for example, as you remember. So there are clearly contradictions to work with, which is a good thing. And some of the contradictions clearly have also translated into polls. As you know, polls are usually a reflection of the balance of class forces and of social forces in society. They're not independent of it. I think some of the ways in which Ford slumped in the polls, I think, is a result, not simply a neutral expression of the limits of his regime. The Ontario provincial election, of course, also is a bit of a result of that. But nonetheless, Ford remains a big challenge, of course, for us, despite everything. It would be wrong to stop taking him seriously, which we all have started to do after making fun of him for a while. I think he's wrong still today to underestimate Ford regime, precisely because, not just because of Ford for himself, but indeed the support for a lot of his policies, with some exceptions, is actually quite broad at City Hall and elsewhere. The second thing is why Ford is a challenge for us is because of the breadth of his project, intended or otherwise. He asks all of us, to some extent, to develop a perspective that is as broad as his own, that is indeed able to respond to the racist, homophobic dimensions of his platforms as much as it is capable to respond to his attacks on workers and on labor unions. So to some extent the onus is on us indeed to present a perspective that measures up to all aspects of Ford's populist politics. And that's also true for the specific question of how to fight budgets. It's one of the most difficult things, of course, to develop austerity, counter-austerity politics in any context, but certainly in a municipal context where you've got such a broad array of specific issues, if you like, that are targeted and that are potential sites of resistance, right? And so, again, the onus is on us to say, look, I mean, we got to do more than to add on and add up a list of issues that we should respond to. We should develop a sort of a radical reformist, if you like, mid-term strategy to say, well, here is a class perspective that takes into account questions of race, gender, and sexuality, that actually has a strong policy-level alternative to environmental issues, to questions of parks management, to housing, to transit, of course, to the public sector, to the relationship between public sector and democratic decision-making, the whole array. To say, well, because it's such a perspective that will allow us to say, well, we stand on our own terms. We don't just fight back because there is another initiative coming down the pipe. At the end of the day, we have to stand up on our own feet, and I think some of the literature that we've developed, of course, goes exactly in that direction. I'll give you a couple of examples of the danger of simply reacting by defending the status quo. I mean, we've seen this in Toronto. TCHC, the Toronto Housing Company, right? When Ford's allies managed to exploit those tiny little scandals at the board of TCHC, the public reaction of the NDP councillors at City Hall was to simply defend TCHC management, as if everything was fine and dory with TCHC. So that was a totally unreflected response. I mean, we know from public sector tenants, of course, that there's a lot of things to be said for a serious critique of TCHC, even if you support public housing, of course. Right? Indeed, there are indications that Ford actually was successful in some public housing districts, mobilizing resentment of tenants who were pissed off, of course, rightly so, with a lack of maintenance, with cockroaches, with arrogant public housing officials. So in that context, to simply defend TCHC as if the status quo ante is just fine is not good enough. Same thing for the Olympic bid, for example. The local councillor, the councillor for this area, suggested that Ford should be more democratic and actually ask more people if we should go for another Olympic bid in the city. As if this is somehow a progressive response to Ford suggesting, no, let's leave this Olympic bid business to the side. We won't deal with it, right? So let me just wrap up here. I mean, at the end of the day, I think the point here is simply to say that we have essentially we're not in a position to only respond to the cuts. I mean, this is obviously the important thing to do today. But if the past is any indication, we need to indeed develop both a capacity and a perspective that allows us to develop a political alternative, not just to Ford, but also to the sort of left liberal progressive alternative to Ford as it presents itself on City Council today. So I'll leave it.